The Little Mermaid. Far out in the wide sea, where the water is as blue as the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest crystal, where it is so deep that very, very many church towers must be heaped one upon another in order to reach the lowest depth to the surface above. There dwell the merpeople. Now, you must not imagine that there is nothing but sand below the water. No, indeed, far from it. Trees and plants of wondrous beauty grow there, whose stems and leaves are so light that they are waved to and fro by the slightest motion of the water, almost as if they were living beings. Fishes, big and small, glide in and out among the branches, just as birds fly among our trees and hedges. And where the water is deepest, there stands the palace of the Mer King. The walls of the palace are of coral, and the high pointed windows are of amber. The roof, however, is composed of mussel shells, which, as the billows pass over them, are continually opening and shutting. This looks exceedingly pretty, as each of the mussel shells contains a number of bright, glittering pearls, one load of which would be the most costly ornament in the diadem of a king in the upper world. The Mer-King, who lived in this palace, had been a widower for many years. His old mother managed the household affairs for him most efficiently. She was a very clever woman, but extremely proud of her high birth and station, for which reason she wore 12 oysters on her tail, whilst the other inhabitants of the sea, even those distinction, were only allowed 6. In every other respect, she merited unlimited praise, especially for the affection she showed to the 6 little princesses, her granddaughters. They were all very beautiful children, but the youngest was the most lovely. Her skin was as soft and delicate as a rose petal, and her eyes were as blue as the sea. But, like all other mermaids, she had no feet. Her body ended in a tail, like that of a fish. All day long the children used to play in the spacious rooms of the palace, where beautiful flowers grew out of the walls on all sides around them. When large amber windows were opened, fishes would swim into these apartments, just as swallows might fly into our rooms. But the fishes were bolder than swallows. They swam straight up to the little princesses, ate from their hands, and allowed themselves to be stroked. In front of the palace, there was a large garden filled with fiery red and dark blue trees. The fruit upon them glittered like gold, and the flowers resembled bright burning suns. Their stems and leaves swayed in the breeze. The sand that formed the soil of the garden was of a bright blue color, somewhat like flames of sulfur, and a strangely beautiful blue was spread over the whole, so that one might have fancied oneself raised very high in the air, with the sky at once above and below, and yet one was at the bottom of the sea. When the flowers were quite still, the sun might be seen looking like a purple flower out of whose cup streamed the light of the world. Each of the little princesses had her own plot in the garden, where she might plant and sow at her pleasure. One chose her plot to be made in the shape of a whale, another preferred hers to look like a little mermaid. But the youngest princess had hers quite round as the sun, and she planted in it only those flowers that were red as blood. She was a strange child, very quiet and thoughtful. Whilst her sisters were adorning their plots with all sorts of gay things that might have fallen into their hands from strange ships, the youngest asked for nothing, apart from those red flowers which were so much like the sun, but a beautiful white marble statue of a boy, and this only had come from a red ship. She put the marble statue into her plot and planted a weeping willow by its side. That, too, was red as blood. It grew quickly and let its long boughs fall over the statue into the blue sand, where ever-moving shadows played in violet hues. It looked as if the boughs and roots had embracing each other and were also kissing the statue of the graceful young boy. Nothing pleased the little princess more than to hear about the world of human beings living above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her everything she knew about the ships, the towns, the men, and the land animals, and she was particularly pleased when she heard that the flowers of the upper world had a pleasant fragrance, for the flowers of the sea are scentless, and that the woods were green, and that the fish fluttered among the branches of trees could sing with a clear, loud voice. The old lady, of course, meant birds, but she called them fishes because her grandchildren, having never seen a bird, would not understand otherwise. And you have attained your 15th year, she added. You will be permitted to rise to the surface of the sea. You will then sit by moonlight on the rocky cliffs, and you will see the big ships sail past, and you will see the woods and the towns, and even the singing fishes. Next year, the eldest of the sisters would reach this happy age. The second sister was a year younger than the eldest, and the third a year younger than the second, for each of them was 1 year younger than the preceding one. So the youngest had still 6 whole years to wait until that joyful time should come, when she might also rise to the surface of the water and see what is going on in the upper world. However, the eldest promised to tell her and the others everything about what she may see, when the first day of her being of age arrived. But the grandmother gave them but little information, and when the children asked her about one thing or another, she used to say, "Be patient, you'll see for yourselves." But none of the sisters longed so ardently for the day when she could see the earth as the youngest, who were the longest to wait, and so was quite thoughtful. Many a night she stood by the open amber window, looking up at the clear blue water where the fishes were leaping around and playing with each other. She could see the moon and the stars. The light was pale through the water, and they appeared larger than they do to those who live in the upper world. If a shadow passed over them, she knew it must be either a whale or a ship full of human beings sailing by. Never could these last have imagined that far beneath them, the loveliest little mermaid was passionately stretching forth her white hands towards the ship's keel. The day had now arrived for the eldest princess, who had attained her 15th year, and was therefore allowed to rise up to the surface and see. When she returned, she had 1,000 things to relate. Her chief pleasure had been to sit upon a sandbank in the moonlight, looking at the large town which lay on the coast, where lights were beaming like stars, and music was playing. She had heard the distant noise of men and carriages, and she had seen the high church towers, had listened to the ringing of bells, and just because she could not go on shore, she longed the more after all these things. How attentively the youngest sister listened to her words. When next she stood at night by her open window, gazing upward through the dark blue water, her thoughts dwelt so eagerly upon the great city, full of life and sound, that she fancied she could hear the church bells ringing. Next year, the second sister received permission to swim wherever she pleased. She rose to the surface of the sea just when the sun was setting, and this sight so delighted her that she declared it to be more beautiful than anything else she had ever seen above the waters. "The whole thing seemed tinged with gold," she said, "and it is impossible for me to describe to you the beauty of the clouds. Now red, now violet, they glided over me, but still more swiftly there flew over the water a flock of white swans just when the sun was descending. I followed them with my eyes, but the sun disappeared, and the bright rosy light on the surface of the sea and on the edge of the clouds died away gradually. That was the most beautiful sight. There could not be anything more delightful." It was now time for the third sister to visit the upper world. She was the boldest of the six and ventured up a river from its estuary in the sea, 3 miles towards its source. On the shore she saw green hills covered with woods and vineyards, among which stood houses and castles. She heard the birds singing, and the sun shone with so much power that she continually was obliged to plunge below in order to cool her burning face. In a little bay she met with a number of children who were bathing and jumping around. She would have joined their gambols, but the children fled back to the land in great terror. A little black animal barked at her. It was a dog, but she had never before seen a dog, and it frightened her so much that she swam back to the sea. But never could she forget the green woods, the verdant hills, and the pretty children who, although they had no fins, could swim about in the water. The fourth sister was not so bold. She remained in the open sea, but declared on her return home that she thought that nothing could be more beautiful. There were no limits to your gaze, and the sky above looked like a cupola made of glass. She had seen ships sailing by so far off that they looked like seagulls. She had watched the merry dolphins gamboling in the water, and the enormous whales had sent up the air pillars of water with their noses, and that looked like 1,000 sparkling fountains. The year after, the fifth sister attained her 15th year. Her birthday happened at a different season from that of her other sisters. It was winter, so she saw things which the others had not seen at their first outing. The sea was the green color, and immense icebergs were floating on its surface. Each of them, she said, looked like a pearl, although it had much larger than a church tower in the land of human beings. She sat down upon one of these pearls, and let the wind play with her long hair, and all the ships hoisted their sails in terror and escaped as quickly as possible. In the evening the sky was covered with clouds, and whilst the restless sea made the great mountains of ice sink and rise, flashes of lightning burst forth from the clouds, and the thunder rolled on, peal after peal. The sails of all ships were instantly furled, and terror and anxiety reigned on board. She, however, the fifth princess, remained sitting still on her iceberg, looking unconcernedly when the blue zigzag of the lightning flashes fell into the foaming sea. The first time that any of these sisters rose out of the sea, she was quite enchanted at the sight of so many new and beautiful objects. But the novelty soon wore off, and when the grown-up ladies, as they were, at liberty to rise off as they pleased, they were not so eager anymore, and after a few weeks they said their home down below was far more attractive than the upper world. One could live together so cozy. Now and then, of the evening, the five sisters would rise hand in hand from the depth of the ocean. They had beautiful voices, far sweeter than any human voice, and when a storm was coming on, they would swim in front of the ships and sing, describing the happiness of those who lived at the bottom of the sea, and entreating the sailors not to be afraid, but to come down to them. But the mariners did not understand what they sang. They thought what they heard was only the whistling of the wind, and thus they never learned of the hidden glories of the sea. For if the ships were wrecked, all on board were drowned, and none but dead men ever entered the Mer-King's palace. Whilst the five sisters were swimming at evening time, the youngest would remain alone in her father's palace, looking up at them. She felt like weeping, but mermaids cannot weep, and therefore they suffer definitely more than human beings. Oh, if I were but 15, she cried. I know I shall love the upper world and the humans who dwell there. At last, the time she had so longed for had arrived. Well, now it is your turn, said the grandmother. Come here and let me adorn you like you sisters. And she placed on the little princess's hair a wreath of white lilies, whose every petal was one half a pearl. Then she commanded 8 oysters to fasten themselves to the princess's tail, token of her high rank. "But they're so very comfortable, they hurt," said the young princess. "One must not mind slight inconveniences when one wishes to look well," said the old lady. How willingly would the young princess have given up all this splendor in exchange for heavy crown for red flowers of her garden, which were so much more becoming of her. But she dared not do so. "Farewell," she said, and then she rose from the sea as light as a flake of foam. When for the first time in her life she appeared on the surface of the water, the sun had just sunk below the horizon, but all the clouds were still glowing with bright golden and rosy hues like the flowers in her plot. The evening star was shining in the pale western sky. The air was mild and refreshing, and the sea was as smooth as a looking glass. A large ship with 3 masts lay still in the water. One sail only was unfurled, for not a breath was stirring, and the sailors were quietly seated on the cordage and ladders of the vessel. Music and song resounded from the deck, and after it grew dark, hundreds of lamps of all sudden burst forth into the light, so that the ship was outlined in a colorful glow against the dark sky. The little mermaid swam close up to the captain's cabin, and every now and then, when she was raised by the motion of the water, she could see through the clear window panes. She saw within many richly dressed men. The handsomest among them was a young prince with large dark eyes. He could not be more than 16 years old, and in honor of his birthday, that the grand festival was being held, and saw that splendor on the ship. The crew were dancing on deck. When the young prince appeared among them, hundreds of rockets were sent up into the air, turning night into day, and so terrifying the little mermaid that for some minutes she plunged beneath the water. But soon she raised her little head again, and then it seemed as if all the stars were falling down upon her. Large suns revolved around her, bright fishes floated in the air, and all these marvels were reflected on the clear surface of the water. It was so bright on the ship that everything could be seen clearly. And how beautiful the young prince was! He shook hands with the sailors and laughed and jested with them, whilst sweet notes of music mingled in the silence of the night. It had become late, but the little mermaid could not tear herself away from the ship and the handsome young prince. She remained looking through the cabin window, rocked to and fro by the waves. The little lamps were extinguished, and no more shining rockets were sent up into the air. The guns had stopped thundering, and it was only at the bottom of the sea that the echo of the salutes reverberated. Suddenly there was a foaming and fermentation in the depths beneath, and the ship began to move on faster. The sails were spread, the waves rose high, thick clouds gathered over the sky, and the noise of distant thunder was heard. Sailors saw that a storm was coming, so they again furled the sails. The great vessel was tossed about in the tempestuous ocean as though it were a light boat, and the waves rose to an immense height, towering over the ship like mountains. The vessel alternately sank beneath and rose above them. To the little mermaid, this seemed most delightful, but the ship's crew thought very differently. The vessel creaked and groaned, and the stout masts bent under the violence of the wind as though they were thin reeds. Then, all of a sudden, the ship turned over, and the water rushed in. The little mermaid now realized that the crew were in danger, for she herself was forced to be aware of the beams and splinters torn from the vessel and floating about on the waves. At the same time, it became pitch dark, so that she could not distinguish anything. Presently, however, a dreadful flash of lightning disclosed to her the whole of the wreck. Her ship sought the young prince, and the very moment the ship sank into the bottom. At first, she was delighted, thinking that the prince would now come back to her abode, but she soon remembered that humans cannot live in the water, and that therefore, if the prince ever entered her father's palace, he would be dead. But no, he must not die. She swam through the fragments with which the waters were strewn, regardless of the danger she was incurring, and braving the towering waves. At last she found the prince, all but exhausted. His arms and legs were tired, and he was keeping his head above water with great difficulty. He had already closed his beautiful eyes, and he would inevitably have drowned had not the little mermaid come to the rescue. She seized hold of him and kept him above water, letting the current bear them on together. In the morning, the storm had subsided. No trace whatsoever had remained of the ship. The sun rose like a ball of fire out of the sea, and it looked like as if the prince's lips had come to life again, and the sun's rays seemed to restore color to his cheeks. But his eyes were still closed. The little mermaid kissed his fine, high forehead and stroked his wet hair away from his face. He looked like the marble statue in her garden. She kissed him again and wished most fervently that he might recover. She now saw the dry land with snow-capped mountains glittering in the sun. The green wood extended along the coast, and at the entrance of the wood stood a building, chapel, or church, or convent. She was not sure which. Citron and melon trees with yellow fruits grew in the garden adjoining it. An avenue of tall palm trees led up to the door. Here the sea formed a little bay, which the water was quite smooth, but very deep. Under the cliffs there was firm, dry sand. Hither swam the little mermaid with a seemingly dead prince. She laid him upon the warm sand and took care to place his head high and to turn his face to the sun. The bells began to ring in the large white building which stood before her, and a number of young girls came out to walk in the garden. The mermaid swam away from the shore and hid herself behind some stones and covered her head with foam so that her little face would not be seen, and watched the prince with unremittent attention. It was not long before one of the young girls approached. She seemed quite frightened at finding the prince in a state, apparently dead. Soon, however, she recovered herself and ran back to tell her sisters. The little mermaid saw that the prince revived, and that all around smiled joyfully and kindly upon him. But he did not send any smile to her. He did not know it was she who had saved him. And when the prince was taken into the house, she felt so sad that she immediately plunged beneath the water and returned to her father's palace. If she had been quiet and thoughtful before, she now grew even more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen that first time in the upper world, but all she said was a ship and a house, and then she fell silent and said no more. Many an evening and many a morning she rose to the little bay where she had left the prince. She saw the snow on the mountains melt, the fruits in the garden ripened and were gathered, but the prince she never saw, so she always returned sorrowfully to her home under the sea. Her only pleasure was to sit in her little garden and to put her arms around the beautiful marble statue that was so like the prince. She no longer cared for her flowers. They grew wild in profusion, covered the steps and the path, and entwined their long stems and tendrils among the boughs of the trees, until her whole garden became a dark bower. At last, being unable to bear her sorrow any longer, she revealed the secret to one of her sisters, who told it to the other princesses, who passed it on to some friends. Among those friends was a young mermaid who remembered the prince, having herself been an eyewitness to the festivities on his ship. She knew also in what country the prince lived, and even the name of its king. "Come, little sister," said the five princesses, and embracing her, they rose together arm in arm out of the water, just in front of the prince's palace. The palace was built of bright yellow stones, and a flight of white marble steps led down from it down to the sea. Gilded cupolas crowned the building, and white marble figures, which might almost have been taken for real men and women, were placed among the pillars surrounding it. Through the clear glass of the high windows one could look into magnificent apartments hung with silken curtains, and the walls adorned with beautiful paintings. In the center of the largest room they saw a fountain playing, whose waters sprang up so high to catch the glittering cupola above, through which fell the sunbeams dancing in the water. Now, the little mermaid knew where her beloved prince dwelt, and henceforth she went there almost every evening. She often approached nearer the land than her sisters ever ventured, and even swam up the narrow channel that followed under the marble balcony. Here on bright moonlit nights she would sit, her hair enveloping her like a cloak, and watch the young prince whilst he believed himself alone. Sometimes she saw him sailing on the water in a gaily painted boat. She would then hide among the green reeds which grew on the banks, and when the prince was noticing the rustling of her long silver veil, he thought it was the swan flapping his wings. Many a night, when the fishermen were casting their nets by the beacon's light, she heard them talking of the prince and relating how noble actions he had performed. She was then happy, thinking how she had saved his life when struggling with the waves, remembering how his head had rested on her bosom, and how she had kissed him when she knew nothing of it, and could never even dream of her existence. Human beings became more and more dear to her every day. She wished that she were one of them. Their world seemed to her much larger than that of her father's kingdom. They could sail over the ocean in ships. They could climb to the summits of those high mountains that rose above the clouds, and their wooded domains extended much farther than a mermaid's eye could penetrate. There were many things that she wished to have explained, but her sisters could not give her any satisfactory answers. So she had to ask the old grandmother, who knew a great deal about the upper world, which she used to call the country above the sea. Do men, when they're not drowned, live forever? She asked one day. Do they not die as we do and live at the bottom of the sea? Yes, was her grandmother's reply. They must die as we do, and their life is much shorter than ours. We live to the age of 300 years, and when we die, we become a foam on the sea and are not allowed even to share a grave among those that are dear to us. We have no immortal souls. We can never live again, and are like the green rushes which, when once cut down, are withered forever. Human beings, however, have souls that continue to live when their bodies become dust. And as we rise out of the water to admire the abode of men, so these souls ascend to glorious unknown dwellings in the skies, which we are not permitted to see. Why have we not immortal souls? Asked the little mermaid. I would willingly give up the 285 years I have in front of me to be a human being for only one day, thus become entitled to that heavenly world above. You must not think of that, answered the grandmother. You are much better off as one of us. We live longer and are happier than human beings. So I must die and be dashed like foam over the sea, never to rise again and to hear the gentle murmur of the oceans, never again to see the beautiful flowers and the bright sun and the marble staircase that leads to the princess's house. Tell me, dear grandmother, is there no means by which I can obtain an immortal soul? No, there is not, said the old lady. Unless you could win the affection of a human being, and as to become dear to him than either father or mother. If he joined you with all his heart and promised whilst the priest joined his hand to yours to be always faithful to you, then his soul would flow into yours, and yet he would retain that. That is a marvelous thing, and you will become a partaker of human bliss. But that could never be, for what in our eyes is the most beautiful part of our body, our tail? The inhabitants of the earth think them hideous, and they cannot bear it. To appear handsome to them, the body must have two clumsy props which they call legs, and that is all I'm going to tell you. The little mermaid sighed and looked wistfully at the scaly part of her body, otherwise so fair and delicate.
"You are happy," added the old lady.
We shall jump and swim about merrily for 300 years, and that is a long time, and afterwards we shall repose peacefully in death. And this evening we are going to have a court ball. The ball of which the grandmother spoke was far more splendid than any that the earth has ever seen. The halls of the great hall were crystal, very thick yet clear. Hundreds of large mussel shells were planted in rows among them. Some of these shells were rose-colored, some green as grass, but all sending forth a bright light, which not only illuminated the whole apartment, but also shone through the glassy walls as they light up the waters around, and making the scales of countless fishes, crimson and purple, silver and gold-colored, appear more brilliantly than before. Well, the center of the hall flowed a bright, clear stream, on the surface of which danced mermen and mermaids to the melody of their own sweet voices, voices far sweeter than those of men. The little princess sang most sweetly of all. Her father kissed her in appreciation, and the mermen clapped their hands and applauded her. For a moment it pleased her to be thus reminded that neither on earth nor in the sea was there more beautiful voice than hers. But her thoughts soon returned to the world above her. She could not forget the handsome prince, and sorrowed that she could not have an immortal soul. She stole away from her father's palace, and lost all the joy within. She sat alone in her little neglected garden. Suddenly she heard the tone of horns resounding over the water, and she said to herself, "Now you're sailing above there, he whom I love more than my father and my grandmother, with whom my thoughts are constantly occupied, to whom I would so willingly trust the happiness of my life. Oh, why risk leaving him in the mortal soul? While my sisters are dancing in the palace, I need to go to the enchantress, whom I have hitherto feared so much. Perhaps she can advise me and help me." So the little mermaid left the garden and went to the foaming whirlpool beyond which dwelt the enchantress. She had never been this way before. There were no flowers here, nor any seagrass, only bare gray sand. The waters of the whirlpool were eddying and bubbling, and she was obliged to make her way through the horrific place. And then she had to pass through the slimy bog which the enchantress called her turf mill. Her house stood in a wood beyond this. All the trees and bushes looked around like 100-headed serpents. Their branches were long, slimy arms with fingers of worms, every member from the root to the tip, ceaselessly moving and extending on all sides. Whatever they seized, they fastened upon so that it could not loose itself from their grasp. The little mermaid stood still for a moment and looked at the horrible wood, her heart beating with fear, and she would certainly have returned without obtaining her object, had she now remembered the prince and immortality. The thought gave her new courage. She tied her long hair firmly around her head so that serpent-like plants could not catch hold of it, and crossed her delicate arms over her bosom. And swifter than a fish can glide through the water, she passed through these same seemingly trees, and stretched their eager arms after her in vain. She saw that every tree had something in its grasp, held as firmly as 1,000 little arms that have not been closed by iron hands. The skulls of human beings who had been drowned in the sea, helms, chests, skeletons of land animals, even a little mermaid whom they had seized and strangled. That indeed was a most fearful sight for the unfortunate little princess. But she got through this wood of horrors. When she arrived at a slimy spot where immense fat snails were crawling about on their ugly yellow bodies, in the midst of the place stood a house built out of bones of unfortunate people who had been shipwrecked. Here sat the witch, caressing a toad as some people would stroke a bird. The ugly fat snails she called her chickens, and she permitted them to crawl about her. "I know full well what you are going to ask of me," she said to the little princess. Your wish is foolish enough, yet it shall be fulfilled, though it is sure to bring misfortune to you, my dear child. You wish to get rid of your tail, to have instead two stilts like those of human beings, in order that a young prince may fall in love with you, and love you more than himself, so that you may obtain an immortal soul. And she laughed so violently that the toad folk knew up. You have come just at the right time, she continued. Had you come after sunsets, I should not have been able to help you for the whole year. I shall prepare a drink for you, and with it you must swim up to the land of the humans before sunrise. You must sit on the shore and drink it. Then your tail will split in two and become what humans call legs. This will, however, be very painful. You will feel as though a sharp knife passes through your body. All who look on you will say that you are the loveliest child on earth. You'll retain your undulating way of walking, as no dancer will move so lightly. But every step you take will cause you unbearable pain. It will seem to you as though you were walking on swords, and your blood will flow. If you think you can endure this suffering, I will help you. Yes, I can, answered the princess with a faltering voice, and thought of the young prince and of her immortal soul. Only remember, said the witch, once you have received a human soul, you can never again become a mermaid. You will never return to your sisters in your father's palace, never to your grandmother and to your little garden. And unless you win the prince's love to such a degree that he leaves his mother and father for you, and clings to you with all his thoughts and wishes, and unless the priest joins your hands, so that you become husband and wife, you will never obtain the immortal soul that you are craving for. Morning of the day on which he is united in matrimony to another woman. That morning your heart will break and you will die and become foam on the sea. And yet I will venture it, said the little mermaid, pale and trembling, as if she were already about to die. Besides all this, I must be paid, and it is no slight thing that I demand, continued the witch. Yours is the sweetest voice of all the dwellers in the sea, and you are thinking of captivating the prince with it. This voice, however, you will give to me. The best thing you possess I require for my magic drink, and for I shall have to put it into my own blood to give it the sharpness of a two-edged sword. But if I give you my voice, asked the little princess, what have I left with which to charm the prince? You have your graceful form, your undulating walk, your expressive eyes. With such it shall be easy to infatuate the vain human heart. Well now, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue so that I may cut it off and take it for myself in return for my magic drink. So be it, said the princess, and the witch set up her cauldron in order to mix her potion. Cleanliness is a good thing, she remarked, and she took a handful of snails and tied them together and scrubbed the cauldron with them. Then she scratched her own skin and let the black blood trickle into the cauldron, every moment throwing in new ingredients. The smoke from the mixture assumed such horrible forms that they were enough to fill the beholder with terror, and the moaning and groaning proceeded as though from a crocodile were weeping. At last the drink was ready, and had become as clear and transparent as pure crystal. Here it is, said the witch to the princess, and she cut out her tongue at the same moment. The poor little mermaid was now dumb, and she could neither sing nor speak. "If the branches of the trees of my beautiful wood should attempt to seize you as you pass," advised the witch, "sprinkle some of the liquid over them, and they will split into so many pieces, and you will not be able to count how many." But the princess did not have to follow the advice, for the branches drew back hastily as soon as they perceived the bright violet glittering in her hand like an evening star. Then she passed safely through the formidable wood, over the eerie moor, across the foaming maelstrom, and no harm befell her. From afar she gazed once again at her father's palace. The lamps of the stateroom were all extinguished. All the family was probably asleep already. The little mermaid would have loved to go in for one last time, kiss them all goodbye, but she did not dare, for she could not speak. She was about to leave her beloved, beautiful home forever. She felt as though her heart would break at the thought, and she stole into the garden and plucked a flower from the bed of each of her sisters as remembrance, and threw 1,000 glances at her father's house, and rose to the dark blue waters to the world above. The sun had not yet risen when she arrived at the prince's dwelling. She sat down on the lowest step of the marble staircase. The moon still shone in the sky when the little princess drank off the magic liquid, and she felt it run through like a sharp knife. She fell down in a swoon, and lay for a long time as though lifeless. When the sun rose, she awoke, and felt a burning pain in all her limbs. But she saw standing close to her was the object of her love, the handsome young prince, and his dark eyes were fixed inquiringly on her. Shyly she cast down her eyes and perceived that instead of a long fish-like tail, she had 2 slender legs. But she was quite naked, and tried in vain to cover herself with her long thick hair. The prince asked her who she was and how she had got there, and she in reply smiled and gazed upon him with her bright blue eyes, for, alas, she could not speak. Then he led her by the hand into the palace. She found that all the witch had said had come true. She felt as though she were walking on the edges of sharp swords, but she bore the pain willingly. Holding the prince's hand, she ascended the broad staircase as lightly as if she were swan down, and all eyes followed her admiringly, and everybody praised her graceful way of walking. Rich clothes of silk and lace were brought to her. Wherever she walked, she was the loveliest of all, but she was mute, and could neither speak nor sing. Some female slaves, gaily dressed in gold brocade, sang before the prince and his royal parents, and one of them had a specially clear, sweet voice. The prince applauded and smiled at her. This made the little mermaid very sad, for she knew that she used to sing far better than the young slave, and she thought, but know that I was given away my voice forever for the sole purpose of being with him." The slaves began to dance their lovely, graceful dances to the tune of a flute. Now the little mermaid rose and stretched out her delicate white arms and lifted herself on tiptoe, floated over the marble floor. She danced as nobody on earth had ever danced before, and every motion displayed the perfect symmetry and elegance of her figure, and the expression in her eyes touched the hearts of the spectators far more than the song of the slaves had done. Everybody was enchanted, but especially the young prince who called her his little foundling. And she danced again and again, although every step caused her great pain. The prince then said that she should always be with him, and a sleeping place was prepared for her on velvet cushions in the anteroom of his own apartment. The prince caused a suit of male apparel to be made for her, in order that she might accompany him on rides and horseback. Together they traversed the fragrant woods where green boughs brushed against their temples. A little bird sang merrily among the fresh leaves. With him she climbed up steep mountains, and although her tender feet bled, which were observed by the attendants, for which she was pitied, she only smiled and followed her dear prince to the heights whence they could see the clouds chasing each other. But at night, when everybody in the palace was asleep, she would walk down the marble steps in order to cool her burning feet in the deep waters, and think of those beloved who dwelt below. One evening, as she was bathing her feet, her sisters ran together to the spot, arm in arm. She beckoned to them, and they immediately recognized her and told her how much sorrow she had caused them. From that time, the sisters visited her every night, and once they brought with them the old grandmother, who had not been to the upper world for many great years. They likewise brought their father, the Merkin. His hair had gone gray, and the crown on his head shimmered as though of stone. These two old people stretched their hands out to her, but did not venture near enough to speak. The little mermaid became dearer and dearer to the prince every day, but he only looked upon her as a sweet, gentle child, and the thought of making her his wife never entered his head. But his wife she would have to become, for she would never acquire an immortal soul, but would change into foam and be driven restlessly over the billows of the sea. Do you love me? Do you love me more than all the others? Her eyes seemed to ask when he pressed fondly on her arm, and kissed her lovely brow. Yes, the prince would say. You are dearer to me than any other one, for no one as good as you. You're devoted to me, and you are again like the young maiden who saw but once and may never see again. I was on board a ship which was wrecked by a sudden tempest, and the waves threw me on the shore near a holy temple where a number of young girls were doing religious service. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her only once, but her image is vividly impressed upon my memory, and her alone I can love. But she belongs to the holy temple, and you who resemble her so much have been given to me for consolation. Never will we be parted. He does not know that it is I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid, sighing deeply. I bore him over the wild waves into the water bay, and laid him down on the sand in front of the holy temple. I sat behind the rocks covered with foam and waited till somebody should come. I saw the pretty maiden approach whom he loves more than me. And again she heaved a deep sigh, for she could not weep. He says that the young girl belongs to the holy temple. She never comes out into the world, so they cannot meet each other again. And I am always with him. I can see him daily. I will love him and devote my whole life to his service. The prince is going to be married to the beautiful daughter of the neighboring king, said the people, and that is why he is having that splendid ship fitted out. He is going to use it for a journey of courtship, and a large retinue is accompanying him. The little mermaid smiled at these and similar rumors, for she knew the prince's intentions better than anybody else. I must go, said Thor. I must see the beautiful princess. My parents wish me to do so, but they will not compel me to marry her and bring her home as my bride. It is quite possible for me to love her, for she cannot be so like that beautiful girl in the temple as you are. And if I were obliged to take a girl for my wife, I should prefer you, my little silent fountain with sparkling eyes. And he kissed her rosy lips and played with her long curls and folded her in his arms, whereupon she had a sweet vision of human happiness and immortal bliss. You are not afraid of the sea, my sweet silent child, he asked her as they stood together on the splendid ship which was to take them to the country of his neighboring king. And then he told her of the storms, the strange fishes, and all the wonderful things he had seen by divers described in books. And the little mermaid smiled at his words, for she knew better what it was to look at the bottom of the sea. At night time, when the moon shone brightly, and when all on board were asleep except the pilot, she would sit on the deck looking down into the sea. It seemed to her that she saw her father's palace and her grandmother's silver crown for the foamy track made by the ship's keel. Then her sisters would rise out of the water, looking sorrowful and stretching their hands towards her. She waved to them, smiling, and would have explained that everything was going to be according to her wishes, and she was happy. But then the cabin boy approached, whereupon the sisters plunged beneath the water so suddenly that the boy thought what he had seen in the waves was nothing but foam. The next morning the ship entered the harbor of the neighboring king's splendid capital. All the church bells were rung, and trumpets sounded from the belfry of the palace, and soldiers marched in procession through the city with waving banners and glittering bayonets. Every day witnessed new entertainment. Balls and parties followed each other. The princess, however, was not yet in town. She had been sent to a distant convent for education, there to be taught the practice of royal virtues. At last, she arrived at the palace. The little mermaid had been anxious to see this unparalleled princess, and now she was obliged to admit to herself that she had never before seen so beautiful a creature. Her skin was white and delicate, and the veins could be seen, and her dark eyes sparkled beneath a pair of long lashes. "It is you," said the prince when they met. "You who saved my life when I lay dead on the seashore." "Oh, I am all too happy," said to his dumbfounding. "What I never dared to hope for has come to pass. You must rejoice in my happiness, for you love me more than all the others who surround me." And the little mermaid kissed his hand in silent sorrow. It seemed to her as if her heart were breaking already, although the morning of his marriage day, which would inevitably see her death, had not yet dawned. The engagement was announced. All the church bells rang. Silver lamps were burning in front of the altars. The incense burners emitted fragrant flames. The bride and bridegroom joined hands, whilst the holy words that united them were spoken. The little mermaid, clad in silk and gold, stood behind the princess and held the train of the bridal dress. But her ear heard nothing of solemn music. Her eyes saw nothing of the holy ceremony. She thought of her approaching end and realized that she had lost both this world and the next. That very same evening, bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Cannons were fired and flags waved in the breeze. In the center of the deck was raised a magnificent pavilion of purple and gold cloth, fitted up with richest and softest couches. Here the princely pair were to spend the night. A favorable wind swelled the sails, and the ship glided lightly over the blue waters. As soon as it was dark, colored lamps were hung out, and dancing began on the deck. The little mermaid was reminded of what she had seen the first time she had risen to the upper world. The spectacle that now presented itself was equally splendid, and she was obliged to join in the dance, gliding lightly as a bird over the ship's moorings. All applauded her, for never had she danced with more enchanting grace. The little feet suffered extremely, but she no longer felt the pain. The anguish of her heart, suffering was much greater. She knew it was the last evening she would ever see him for whom she had forsaken her home and family, and given away her beautiful voice, and suffered daily the most violent pain, all without having the least suspicion. It was the last evening that she could breathe the same air as her beloved, that she would behold the deep blue sea and the starry heavens and eternal night, on which she would neither think nor dream awaited her. All was joy on the ship, and she, her heart filled with the thoughts of death, smiled and danced with the others till past midnight. Then the prince kissed his lovely bride, and arm in arm they entered the magnificent tent prepared for their repose. All now was still. The stairmaid alone stood at the ship's helm. The little mermaid rested her wide arms on the balusters and looked toward the east, watching for the dawn. She well knew that the first sunbeam would witness her disillusion. She saw her sisters rise out of the sea, deadly pale with their features, long hair no longer fluttering over their shoulders. It had all been cut off. "We have given it to the witch," they said, "to make her help you, so that you may not die this night. In exchange, she has given us a sharp knife. Look, here it is. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood trickles down on your feet, they will again be changed to a fish-like tail. Then you will once become a mermaid, and will be able to dive down into us and live in your allotted span of 300 years before you become foam on the water. But hasten, one of you has to die before the sun rises, either you or he. Our aged grandmother has mourned for you so much that the gray hair has fallen off through sorrow, and hers fell under the scissors of the witch. Kill the prince and come down to us. Hasten! Can you see the red streak of the eastern sky announcing the approaching of the sun? A few minutes more, and all will be over for you." These words they sighed deeply and vanished. The little mermaid drew aside the purple curtains of the pavilion. There lay the beautiful bride in the arms of the bridegroom. She kissed the prince's forehead, and glanced up to the sky over the dawning light, became brighter every moment. The prince's lips unconsciously murmured the name of his bride. He was dreaming of her, and her alone, while the fatal knife trembled in the hand of the unhappy mermaid. All at once she threw the instrument of death far out into the sea. The waves rose like a bright blazing flames around it, and the water fell where it seemed tinged with blood. With eyes fast becoming dim and fixed, she looked once more at her beloved prince, then plunged from the ship into the sea, and felt her body slowly but surely, gently dissolving at the foam. The sun rose from the waters of the sea. The beams fell softly and warmly upon her, so that the little mermaid was scarcely aware that she was dying. She saw the glorious sun. Above her head there hovered 1,000 beautiful transparent forms. So transparent were they that, though she could distinguish the white floating sails from the ship, red clouds, sky. The voices of these airy creatures had a melody so sweet and soothing that a human ear would be as little able to catch the sound as the eye could discern the forms. Borne through the air by their own lightness, they hovered about her without wings, affectionately and tenderly, with a wondrous serenity. The little mermaid saw that they were body of the transparent as theirs, and felt herself gradually raised from the foam into the sea to higher regions. "Where are they taking me?" she asked, no longer voiceless, and her sense sounded just like the voices of those heavenly beings. "To the daughters of the air," they answered. "The mermaid has no mortal soul and can only acquire that heavenly gift by winning the love of one of the sons of men. Their immortality depends upon union with men. Neither do the daughters of the air possess immortal souls, but they can acquire them by their own good deeds. We fly to hot countries where the children of the earth suffer from pestilential breezes and revive them with our fresh cooling breath. We perfume the atmosphere with the delicious fragrance of flowers, and thus spread the light and health of the earth. There is much suffering on earth, and we try to soothe it. By doing good for 300 years, we win immortality, receive a share of the eternal bliss of the human beings. You, poor little mermaid, having done and suffered so much following the impulse of your own heart, you now are performing deeds of kindness for 300 years. Also, acquire an immortal soul." The little mermaid lifted her transfigured face to the sun, and for the first time in her life, tears moistened her eyes. But there was some upheaval in the ship. The prince and his bride were looking for the mute foundling. Sorrowfully they looked down into the foamy waters as if they knew she'd plunged into the sea. Unseen, she kissed the bridegroom's forehead, smiled at the bride, then with the other children of the air soared high above the rosy cloud which was sailing so peacefully with the ship. And the daughters of the air sang their lovely song. "We fly invisibly over the dwellings of men, where there are children, and for every day we find a good child who gives pleasure to his parents and deserves their love. The good God shortens our time of probation. No child is aware that we're flitting about in his room, and knows that whenever joy brings a small smile, a year struck off from our 300. But when we see a naughty child, we weep bitter tears of sorrow, and every tear adds a day to our time of probation."